Hey guys, how's it going? Mythron4 here, and today we will be talking a little bit about the upcoming Iris of the Light and Dark event that will have just dropped on the EN server by the time that this video comes out. But Iris is going to be the next large-scale event hitting us in EN as of the June 26th, June 27th update. Uh, give you a quick summary of what the new content is. We're going to get 8 new ships, we'll get 3 new retrofits, we're going to get 2 prominent new equipment featured in the event, along with the obligatory several skins. This video is going to focus on the event based on what happened in JP, CN, and KR during their launch of the event. So if there aren't things that are one-to-one with the other servers, keep in mind that there are some slight server differences that may exist between the different launches of the event at the time. So Iris of the Light and Dark is going to comprise of 2 worlds with 3 maps each. There will also be a hard mode version of each map with the optional EX map for a total of 13 event maps. As with every other previous large scale event, Worlds A and B, which are the normal mode maps, will be relatively easy, with the fights being a little less than level 60 at B3. Hard maps are going to yield more event currency, but the fights are going to range from level 60 to level 90 based on the map. And event rewards actually come in 4 different varieties this time around. Aside from your standard milestone reward for your event currency accumulation and getting all the event shop stuff, there will also be an oil consumption like milestone for a special skin for one of the new ships, as well as a special javelin event for a separate small scale event that's available to us. So with the Iris of the Light and Dark event, we're going to have 8 new ships. 7 of them are going to come from the new factions, the French-based Iris Libre and Vicia Dominion factions, and they come in 3 different ways. So we have 5 of them coming from construction, we have 2 of them that come from the event shop or from dropping on the map, and then we have 1 ship that come from the milestone reward. So without further ado, I'll give you a brief introduction of each of them and kind of my first thoughts on each ship as I see them. So first up, we're going to have the Vicia Dominion battleship John Bart, super rare. She's kind of the main ship for the event. So she's going to be kind of the first ship to have an emphasis on manual play. So her first skill increases the damage output on her first salvo, and it greatly increases the damage further if the salvo is manually aimed. Her second skill is also pretty free, because she gets a bonus on her main gun's crit rate and damage if she equips her unique gun, which is going to be a part of the event shop that I talked about earlier. Overall, I actually think John Bart's a pretty solid ship. Her stat line is comparable to that of Nagato if you want a ship to compare her to. And even though she doesn't give utility, her skill set makes her really good for manual players who want to use single backline fleets. And I actually recommend auto farmers to start learning a bit of manual play so that you can kind of get the rewards of playing with John Bart. Next up, we will have the Eagle Union USS Battleship Massachusetts, another super rare. She's kind of like the more offensive-minded sister to South Dakota. When you think of South Dakota, you kind of think about protecting the fleet and being the primary tank. Massachusetts is more about getting power based on the fleet composition, which is based off of her fellow Eagle Union heavy cruisers and battleships. And on top of that, her second skill changes her damage property to a unique type and does bonus damage based on how far the salvo travels. Unfortunately, Massachusetts is not as versatile as South Dakota, but her abilities do make her actually not a bad candidate for being run in late game worlds, because Eagle Union battleships and retrofitted Portland, if you want to maximize on the Massachusetts synergy, provide enough bulk and anti-air stat so that you can weather some of the harsher mob fights and bosses. I recommend giving her a shot if you manage to have time. Next up, we have the Vicia Dominion Battle Cruiser Dunkirk and Elite. She's personally my favorite ship in the event because of her aesthetic, but performance-wise, she's a little underwhelming. Her only skill gives her a chance to launch an additional barrage when her main gun is fired. Comparing her, she performs like a Big 7 ship, but because she has a battle cruiser classification, she has a slower stat line and she has a restriction to DD guns in the secondary. Honestly, Dunkirk isn't really like much more than collection fodder if you are used to running Big 7 as part of a regular part of your fleet, but I I personally like her, so I'm gonna run her because she's a cute girl and I really like her design. I think she's not that bad. Next up, we were going to see the Iris Libre FFNF submarine Surkov and Elite. Surkov is currently the tankiest submarine available in the game stats wise. Unfortunately, submarines don't actually have too much use aside from dealing chip damage when you use the deploy option. The damage reduction when using the hunter mode is nice when you're trying to do the low level ships in high level fight situations, but unfortunately, submarines in general are still relatively negligible parts of combat in Azur Lane at the moment. Hopefully, we're gonna see a time when deploying submarines come into play for more uses than just a little bit of chip damage. But unless boss fights implement submarine disruption, like deploying submarines prevents the enemy like destroyers or light cruisers from firing their barrages, there isn't really a good use for submarines, and I wouldn't say they're a waste of fuel, but they're pretty impractical uses of fuel at the given time. Next up, we'll have the Iris Libre Destroyer Forbin, who's a rare. Forbin's a nice addition to the Iris Libre Vicia Dominion lineup. Her primary skill on release is that she will give a damage reduction bonus to the entire fleet if the frontline, the Vanguard, is only Iris Libre or Vicia Dominion ships. Thankfully, the event gives us enough ships to make the buff worth running, especially considering that some of the options are going to give additional buffs, which we'll talk about in a bit when we get to those ships. Forbin is going to have a retrofit as well that drops when the patch drops. Once she gets retrofitted, she gets a skill that gives her a chance to evade all attacks for a period of time, which gives her a small boost in survivability that lets her prolong her utility. Destroyers typically start becoming less viable than light cruisers when you start getting to the late game worlds, but I think that running a full Iris Libre and Vicia Dominion frontline is still pretty worth for if you're gonna try and do farming and any other like danger level succeeded tasks. So those 5 were part of the construction only pool. So next we're gonna talk about the event shop reward ships. So first we have the Iris Libre Destroyer Le Triomphant, who's a super rare. She's kind of the big one of the event shop, the bigger of the two. She's kind of an interesting solo destroyer actually. So her 2 skills involve increasing her damage output, both coming at a relative cost. On her first skill, she increases her reload when her main gun is fired, but only if you're hitting the same target repeatedly, while her second skill increases her main gun damage output, but she must be the lead ship, which means she must be in the leftmost slot of the front line, and she sacrifices her anti-air stat. Unfortunately, that makes her not particularly strong, even if you have an optimal environment for her skills, when you compare her in performance to some of the other better destroyers. I don't recommend using her in mob fights since it prevents her first skill from consistently getting to max proc, but using her as a solo also comes at a risk since she doesn't really have the survivability to sustain that. Next up, we have the Vicia Dominion Destroyer Le Mars, who's a rare. She is the smaller event. she's the other half of Forbin that I was talking about. Whereas Forbin was about giving your team durability, Mars is more about giving increased damage output to the entire fleet. So Forbin and Mars are kind of the yin-yang dynamic where they both empower the fleet with durability and damage output. Also like Forbin, Mars will have a retrofit that's available once the patch drops, and it's the same skill of evade all attacks for a set amount of time. If you're going to run the Iris Libre Vicia Dominion frontline, I recommend you run Forbin and Mars together if you're ever going to run them. Preferably both of them retrofitted so that you get the survivability. These two give a pretty solid amount of utility to the rest of the fleet that lets them be viable options during mid to late game world farming. Lastly, we'll talk about the milestone reward for the event, the Iris Libre light cruiser Emile Bertin, who's an elite. Emile's kind of the final piece needed to get the Iris Libre Vicia Dominion frontline to full power. So our first skill increases the damage output of the destroyers of the Iris Libre and Vicia Dominion. And then her second skill gives her a speed boost and amplifies her own damage dealt to enemy destroyers and cruisers if the rest of the frontline is Iris Libre and or Vicia Dominion destroyers. So, like with Forbin and Mars, Emile is going to come with a retrofit when the patch drops. The skill obtained on retrofit increases her damage output when you sortier with other destroyers in general, not specifically Vicia Dominion and Iris Libre, and it fires a barrage when a destroyer falls below half health. Vanguard comprised of Emile, Mars, and Forbin can be pretty devastating in terms of damage output and the utility, and I actually think it's one of the highest damage, low cost front lines for farming. The Vanguard can even be taken to the mid and late game worlds situations so that you can reduce the danger level and even do some amount of frontline scouting purely with the amount of utility that they provide. So outside of the ships that are available, what are some of the other important rewards available in the Iris of the Light and Dark? So Iris has a few pretty important ones, but here are the 5 most that I personally found. So first up we have the quadruple 380mm, which is the gun needed for the Jump Art skill to go live. It'll be available as a gear design in the event shop and pretty likely as a hard mode farmable. There's also the single 138.6mm, which is a pretty solid destroyer gun, which will be available as both a gear design and likely in the hard mode. There are going to be the general blueprints, which will be useful for increasing the development level of your priority ships, which will be available in the event shop. A swimsuit skin for Mars, which is a reward for completing the oil consumption milestone. And lastly, there will be a skin for Javelin, which is available if you complete the small scale reward, or the small scale event that's separate from the actual main event. Overall, I find the Iris of the Light and Dark to be probably one of the best events thus far in terms of scale. Like other large-scale events, there's a lot of new content that's available for everyone, but unlike other large-scale events, Iris does a good job of kind of being the great equalizer for players who are approaching the mid to late game status in Azure Lane. The regular and the hard mode versions of the maps have good gear design drops, which make it so that other players who might not have a bunch of good gold gear get an opportunity to farm some rather than try and gamble it away on gearboxes, with Iris being one of the last of the large-scale events needed to catch up to the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Korean server. I think we're in a pretty good spot with this one. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more if you enjoy this type of content.